Good morning, Oak Hill family. It is so good to be with you this morning on this first fall Sunday. First of all, I want to thank Brady for the song leading. I was actually scheduled to lead this Sunday, and Brady was very gracious and willing to pitch in and fulfill that. I'm so thankful for the talents that he has and for Brandon's as well. I want to thank Lucian for asking me to fill in for Michael Ferris, who is out today with his bride Terry, as they celebrated her birthday this week. Evidently, Michael has become a very smart husband over these years at Oak Hill in knowing where your priorities should be. But I am thankful to be here with you and to be able to fill in. And I want to begin this morning by finding my glasses. There they are. I left my normal ones, and so I'm using my travel glasses so that I can see. One of the things of growing old that we have to deal with. But I want to begin with a story today about Mary. Mary is not her real name, but the story I'm about to tell you is real. I met Mary first at David Lipscomb College with some other people. She was one of those people that was attractive, bright, intelligent, witty, funny, and was musically talented and would play the guitar every now and then. But above all this, she loved the Lord. She grew up in a home in an affluent part of a neighborhood outside Washington, D.C. But she grew up in a home that did not mention God. Sometime during her teenage years, she was able to hear her first gospel message. She responded to that message and became a devout Christian. And when she graduated from high school, against her family's wishes, she chose to go to a Christian college, and her dad told her she'd have to pay for it herself. So she took a part-time job and went to David Lipscomb. I would not say that she was a popular person, but those who knew her indeed thought well of her. She graduated from college with honors, but during her time at college, the evidence of her tender heart was easily seen when one day driving down one of the side streets in Nashville, a dog ran out in front of her car. She couldn't avoid the dog. She struck it. Most people would have just kept on driving. The dog's not worth it. But she stopped. And she picked up that bloody animal and put it in her car and took it to the nearest vet and paid the veterinarian to do whatever he could to save the dog. But he couldn't. But after graduating from college, she decided she wanted to do mission work. So she moved to the Virgin Islands. While there, she met a young man that she fell in love with, and they were married. After a few years, they decided to move back to the States to be near her family. While there, she became pregnant with her first child. Near the end of her pregnancy, things would change for her. The doctor soon told her that her child was not right, that it had some defects, what we call birth defects, that probably came from a drug that she was given as a child, a medication that was no longer allowed. Her child would be severely mentally disabled. But during the birth process, the child didn't make it. The child was born dead. Shortly after that, she found out that her husband had been having an affair with her own sister. In retaliation, she had an affair of her own with someone else. A person who once was so devout to God that she would never think of doing something as this. She had gone to a dark place of despair. So one day she came home from work, went to her apartment, and took the time to clean her apartment spotlessly. And then she put on an immaculate white dress and then jumped out of her 8-story window of her apartment. To those of us who knew Mary well, we were totally shocked. When we first heard it, we couldn't believe it. Not Mary. She is faithful to the Lord. She was always optimistic, always upbeat. This can't be true. And yet it was. She had reached the point in her life in which she saw her life as worthless. She had no value to anyone, especially to her own God. So she took her life. Perhaps all of us at one time or another have questioned our worth. Perhaps not to the extent that Mary did, but we have seen ourselves as having little value to our family, our work, our community, and our God. It's during these low times that we are susceptible to the whisperings of Satan, as he encourages us to abandon our faith and simply give in. We are worthless. When I was young, I remember a preacher praying a prayer, and in that prayer, he made the statement, "We are but dung before you, Lord." I wasn't sure at the time what dung meant. Looked it up, found out that it meant manure. So we are but manure before the Lord. But I understood what the minister was trying to say. He was humbling himself and the congregation before God, before God's all omnipotence, his all power, and to say, we are but dung. At the time, it made sense. But now I realize that was wrong. So often we fall into holes of despair and depression when nothing goes right for us, like not getting the job we applied for or getting laid off from the job that we have, by being left by a loved one, not being able to do anything right no matter what we try. Haven't you felt that at times? It is during these times that we become trapped in believing that we are no worth to anyone, including God. And when someone says that you're manure, it only emphasizes it. But in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, as was read by Joe earlier, that the Lord did make us from the dirt. And that's what manure is. It turns it back into dirt. And yet, we use dirt to explain how cheap and worthless things are by comparing them to dirt. I remember as a child, my parents say, those people are dirt poor. It meant that they didn't have anything. But it's important to note that God took one of the most common substances that he made from earth to make man. However, he made that dirt special by giving it his own breath, which brought life into man, as we see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Because dirt is so plentiful, we do not need to underestimate its worth. Without dirt, there is no physical life. The food we eat that sustains life comes from dirt directly or indirectly. Think about it. Our body, our shell, our vessel is made of dirt, but our life did not come from the dirt. It came from God himself. We were made in his image, not from the image of manure. And as Joe read in Ecclesiastes 12:7, it says that we will go back to the dust. The body will go back to the dust, but not the life. Not the life. The life will go back to God who gave it. For some, the worth of a human body is as cheap as dirt. And to illustrate this, I want you to look at some startling statistics in America today. In the year 2020, which is the latest statistics I could find, we had over 20,000 lives taken by someone who thought that their life was not worth it. When Lucian spoke to us last, up here in the pulpit, he mentioned a fast food employee being killed because he served cold French fries to someone. You are not even worth a serving of fries. That's what the world wants you to think. Abortions. In the U.S., 930,000 in 2020. If you look since 1973, 64 million. 64 million people. That's more than several states put together in their entire population. And then in 2020, there were nearly 46,000 suicides. That's one every 11 minutes. Over 12 million people in 2020 said they seriously considered taking their life. And 1.2 million attempted it but failed. Is that what we see that in life that is so worthless, that it is not living, that these statistics do not affect us? Yes, the world may see you as worthless, but what one sees as worthless, someone else sees as priceless. There may be some of you out there right now who feel of little worth. With social media and its influences, you feel that life is not special like theirs, that you literally are worth nothing. Jealousy, lack of attention or respect, a perceived lack of accomplishment seem to only emphasize this belief. And seeing some of the statistics that we have here, we may be drawn into this unholy belief of worthlessness. But do we really think we have no worth? Do you think that you are not worth anything? The New Testament shows us an entirely different picture from this. And though we started off on this note of despair and depression, the rest is good news. It should bring hope and encouragement, because on the contrary, the Bible, the New Testament, tells us just how much we are worth. And we're going to look at 3 examples that Jesus gave us to show us just that. The first one is that of the Good Samaritan. In Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25, we read about this story. We look at this situation that Jesus talked about, this parable. It involved a robbed and beaten Jew, a Levite, a priest, and a Samaritan. The Levite and priest would be considered today as influencers in our society. They were well known, easily recognized, admired, almost worshipped, and everybody wanted to be like them. The Samaritan, well, he's just the opposite. The Samaritans were despised and hated, the brunt of vulgar jokes, and believed to be worth less than, get it, manure. They were dung. They had no value. Devout Jews were repulsed by their very presence. So Jesus, in this story of the Good Samaritan, used 2 extreme groups of people in his story. One group that everybody wanted to be like, and the other group, nobody wanted to be. And yet in the end, we understand that the true friend, the true neighbor, turns out to be the one that those listening to Jesus at the time would probably be repulsed by. It is interesting to note that neither the priest nor the Levite saw any worth on the beaten man who was left dead on the side of the road. But the Samaritan, he saw his worth. The priest and Levi said, oh, he's dead. I can't go check him. If I touch him, I become unclean and unworthy. So that man's life was not even worth the time for them to stop and see if he were yet still alive. But the Samaritan did see that worth in that individual, perhaps because he knew what it felt like for others to think you are worthless. But that's another lesson in and of itself. Suffice it to know that many people post on the internet today to give the impression of worth, while in actuality they feel no worth at all. But in this case, Jesus showed that both the beaten man and the Samaritan were both people of value. The man who was cast to the side and left for dead, and the Samaritan, the race of people that had been mixed from the Jews and despised by the Jews, those were the people who were truly of value to the Lord. In this parable, he chose the lowest of the low to bring light to the Jewish people he was talking to. The second example is that of the woman at the well. And this is recorded in John chapter 4. This is not a story that Jesus told, but an actual experience that he had. Now, Jesus had left Judea, and he was heading up to Galilee. Most Jews would have done this. They would have gone around the long way, because the quickest way to go to Galilee from Judea was go by through Samaria. But a devout Jew says, I'm not going to be tainted. I'm not going to be unclean. I'm not going to be around that filthy people. I'm going to go around. Jesus went straight through. And along the way, he stopped at a place where there was a well that Jacob himself had built. And there this lady came up in the noonday sun to get water. Well, first of all, there's an issue. You don't come during the noon to get water. It was a walk to this well, and it was hot at this time of the day, so the ladies would gather together as a group, and they would go up to the well in the early morning hours while it was still cool to carry this heavy water. Water weighs 8 pounds a gallon. But this lady came by herself in the hottest part of the day. And we'll see why in just a minute. Jesus spoke to her as he sat there and she came to that well. He spoke to her. That's nothing. Then it was something. She was a Samaritan. She knew he was a Jew, and Jews don't speak to Samaritans. They don't acknowledge them. And yet he did. And so when he spoke to her, it startled her. Secondly, he spoke to a woman. This was taboo under the Jewish regulations during the day. You don't speak to a woman, especially a Samaritan woman, who can defile you and make you unclean. This would have been considered totally inappropriate. He was speaking to someone that was not worth his time. Thirdly, she came to the heat of the day because she had to come when nobody else was there. The other women would not be seen with her. Why? Not because she was Samaritan, because they were Samaritans. What's it like to be part of a cast of people that you know someone looks at you as worthless, and yet your own class of people look at you as being worth even less than that? We find out from Jesus talking to her that she had had 5 husbands. And the man that she now lived with was not her husband. She was living in sin, in adultery. Now she got very, very worried. But she tried to get off the subject a little bit, and she talked about the Messiah. But Jesus told her, said, "Let me have a drink from your cup." And she said, "You can't. If you drink from the cup that is mine, that I have touched, you will be unclean. Then you will have to go before your priest and show yourself as clean." How less of an individual can you be that a mere touch shows that you defile someone else? But Jesus said, if you knew who was asking you for the water, you would take the water that I have to give you, that living water. Folks, what I want you to understand at this point in time, Jesus revealed to this Samaritan woman that he was the Messiah. Up to this point in time, when he encountered other individuals, he told them, be quiet, don't tell them what I've done for you. But to this lady, this filth of filth, this adulteress, he said, before you for the first time to the public, I reveal that I am the Messiah. Go to your town and tell them that I have arrived. He used the sinner to announce his coming to the people. Why? Because he came not for the righteous, but to save the ungodly, to show them that no matter how low you are, no matter what you have done, he has come to prove that you are still worthy to him and that you can make yourself right to him. Remember the woman caught in adultery, that story, when all the people leave and he says, where are your condemners? She said, they're all gone. He said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. He was not condoning the sin. He was not condemning the lady. He was condemning what she was doing, and yet condoning her as a human being created through him by God, and that she had the worth to have salvation. And she went about rejoicing and went to the town, and the scripture says that because of what she said, many people believed that the Messiah had come. The third example is that of the leper. Just 3 verses in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 42. It says, now a leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling down to him, if you are willing. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I am willing, be cleansed. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Now, Michael spoke the other day about Naaman and talked about leprosy. To the Jewish people, leprosy was a dreaded disease, so much that protocols were written to contain it. Imagining finding out that you've got leprosy and that being forced to separate yourself from everyone, your family, your community. And as you walked a path, you would have to yell out, unclean, unclean. You are so worthless that no one can even come near you, and that you must warn them that you have this dreaded disease. No longer are you a person, but you are the disease itself. The scriptures itself calls him not by name, but by his disease. What if you had, when you had COVID, because I know many of you did, someone stopped calling you by your proper name and said, COVIDer, you're a COVIDer. Stay away. Don't touch me. Don't even be in the same room with me. And that being your family itself, how would you feel? Lepers were less than manure. They were no longer human. And in this scripture we find out that Jesus did something unbelievable. First of all, he went to the leper. The apostles, no, he's leper. He didn't say he was unclean, but you can see he's unclean. And then he did something unbelievable for that day and even today. He reached out and he touched him. He touched him. The taboo of all taboos, he touched a leper. Immediately, Jesus would be made unclean under the Jewish traditions. But Jesus touched him. And when he touched him, do you realize what he just did? He gave him back his humanity. Though others may feel that this man is worthless, Jesus said, here is the human touch. You are worthy. The man did not ask to be healed. He asked to be cleansed. And when Jesus saw him, the scripture said that he had compassion and he made him clean. If Jesus had just touched the man only and given him back his humanity, that probably was even greater than healing him from the disease itself. Because disease is physical, but losing your humanity, losing your worth, cuts to the soul. Jesus was letting him know, you still have a soul, and my Father created it. You are worthy. But Jesus made him clean to restore everything back to him, his full humanity. He could go back and be reunited with his family. When I was a teenager, I was in a men's training class. You know, a lot of smaller congregations do that. And after doing a few little talks, I was asked to go to a sister congregation a few miles away who the minister had been sick and fill in for him one Sunday morning. I was scared to death. But an elder of the church said, David, if you will do this, I will go with you. You won't be alone. I thought, well, I can't even drive. He had to drive me to the church, which he did. And I was sitting on that front pew, and I was so nervous. And he put his hand on my shoulder. And that touch did so much. It gave me enough courage to stand up and to get in that pulpit and do not so good of a job. But I got it done. And when I sat back down from giving that lesson, he hugged me as I sat beside him, which gave me all the comfort and the encouragement that a 14-year-old boy who would stumble and often stutter in his speech would need to be able to better himself. Don't ever underestimate a touch. The Lord in his touch was showing the worth of this leper. And one final story that I want to tell you. It's a story. I first heard about it from Paul Harvey, and you younger people have no idea who Paul Harvey is. Look him up, Google him, you'll be impressed. But he gave a story that I want to modify a little bit. I've told it once before, long time ago, and I've changed it a bit. Back in the 60s, you didn't have smartphones, you didn't have computers. How did we get by? Communication was limited. And for a salesman to be on the road meant just that. You had to get in your car and drive to these distant towns. And you didn't call in every day to your work. Every now and then you'd stop by a payphone booth, which doesn't exist anymore, and call into the office to tell them how things are going. This salesman enters into this rural town looking for a payphone. There it is. Pulls up to the curb. The town was so rural that you could just see from the outskirts of it, it was surrounded by fields. And as he got into that phone booth and was about to drop his dime into the phone, that's right, young people, a dime, drop his dime into the phone to make electrical contact so that he could make the call, he saw a young lad coming toward the town from the field. He was carrying something. The man's curiosity got the best of him, and so he put the dime back in his pocket, and he waited for the lad as he grew nearer and closer to him. And as he got right up on him, he stopped the young lad and said, "Son, what you got there?" He held it up. It was an old rusty bird cage. He could see something was in there. He said, "Well, what do you got in there?" He said, "Well, I got some birds, mister." "Birds?" "Yeah, I caught some field birds out in the field." "Well, son, what are you going to do with those birds?" "Well, I'm going to have fun with them. I'm going to poke them. I'm going to prod them. I'm going to pull some feathers out of them. I'm just going to have all sorts of fun with them, mister. That's what you do with field birds. They're worthless." And the man looked into the cage and saw the birds. And something strange happened. As he looked at the eyes of those birds, wide with fright, he had compassion. And he looked at the boy and said, "How much?" The boy said, "Mister, what? How much for the birds? How much would you take for them?" Well, the boy was incredulous. "Mister, you don't want these birds. They're worthless. They're not good for anything. They don't serve any purpose. They fly around getting in our way. They poop everywhere. They're of no value to anybody. They will eat your crops." The man looked into the cage yet again and saw the birds trembling with fear. And he said, "Son, how much?" And the boy, to his disbelief, said, $5. The man took out his wallet, paid the $5, and then went gleefully down the road, celebrating his newfound wealth. But the man took the old rusty bird cage to the edge of town, to the field, and opened up that rusty door. And one by one, the birds eventually made their way out to freedom. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Lord came upon Satan. And he said, "Satan, what do you have there? You've got a cage. What do you have in that cage?" And Satan said, "I've got man." "Man? What are you going to do with man?" He said, "Well, Lord, you had him at one time, but he left you. I'm going to play around with him. I'm going to teach him to steal, to lie, to cheat, to murder." And the Lord looked into that cage, and he saw the eyes of man, and they were wide with fright. And just like the leper, he had compassion. And he turned to Satan and he said, "How much?" And Satan said, "What? How much for man?" And Satan said, "You don't want man. You had him at one time. You created him, and he left you. He's good for nothing. He bites the hand that feeds you. He betrays you. He will hurt you. He will nail your hands to the cross, and he will kill you." And Jesus once again looked at the trembling body of man and said, "Satan, how much?" And Satan knew then he had him. He said, "Your life, all your tears, and all your blood." Jesus paid the price to set man free because he was his creation. He knew the worth of man because he had been created in the very image of God. And you may be with us this morning, and you may have had despair and depression in your life. You have felt that you are worth nothing. But Jesus sees something different. How much are you worth? To Jesus, you are worth everything that he had. And if you stand in need of his forgiveness, of his grace, I would encourage you to come while together we stand and sing.